Hello everybody, this is Michelle Fox and welcome back to The Simple Quilter. Today I'm going to be talking about vintage/antique quilts. Now I did have to look up an antique quilt because I wasn't for sure how old a quilt had to be an antique quilt. So here's what I found. An antique quilt is any quilt that is 100 years old or older. And a vintage quilt is anything that was made between 1930 and 1965. Now I feel sure that all of these quilts are vintage quilts at least, or meet the definition of those. But I do believe some of them are antique quilts. And I don't really have a ton of information about these quilts, but I'll share with you what the information that I do have. Now, all of these quilts do belong to me and my husband, and I'll tell you a little bit about each of them. Now, I did even have to look up some of the names of some of the blocks because I really wasn't for sure of the names, and I did use Barbara Brackman's Encyclopedia of Pieced Quilt Patterns. This is what I used to locate the names of the blocks. So I just wanted to share this with you. And I have shared this block before. This is her latest edition. This is her third edition. But it's a really neat resource, a great source for inspiration, just a great book to have. So this is, again, what I use to help identify the blocks in these quilts. Okay, now this first block is a quilt that my mother-in-law gave Wes and I. And this is the story behind that quilt. Wes had a brother and a sister, and we were all over at their house. So his mother said that she had a quilt for each of her kids. That was 2 sons and a daughter. So Wes, being the oldest, got to pick first. And this is the quilt that he picked. Of course, he's like, which one do you want? And I'm like, I want this one. This is probably my favorite antique or vintage quilt. I just love it. It's just a beautiful quilt. This quilt is hand pieced and hand quilted, and the pattern is called Texas Star, and I just love this. So I'm going to show you this quilt and get a little close up for you. I just love this quilt. I like star quilts, and I love the royal blue binding that's on it, and it just has the plain muslin on the back. Okay, the next 5 quilts I acquired from my mother, who acquired them from my aunt and uncle. So that would have been my dad's sister and her husband. Now, I don't have a good history on these, and they couldn't give me a history on these quilts. But nonetheless, they gave them to my mother, knowing that she would be giving them to me. And I really feel honored to have these quilts. I feel honored that they felt I was worthy of having these quilts, because they are fantastic, fantastic quilts. And I love each and every one of them. The first 3 that I will show you are in really good condition, and the last 2 have been worn and used a lot, which I really hope that's how my quilts end up. I want my quilts to be loved and used, and I want them to provide comfort and warmth to the people whom I gave them to. So anyway, this is a lovely quilt. This one's in excellent condition, and this quilt is called Star of the East. And the colors are really interesting. I just love the yellow. I love the lime green. I love the pinks in it. It's just really an extraordinary quilt. And the back is just yellow. I have to wonder if that was maybe dyed. You know, I'm not a quilt historian or a quilt appraiser, so I really don't know. But anyway, let me show you this quilt a little closer. again, this one is another one from my uncle, and this is an extraordinary quilt. This is a whole cloth quilt that has embroidery on it, and it's possible I could have it upside down. I really don't know anything about embroidery, but this is one beautiful quilt, and it is a very large quilt. It extends clear down to the floor. I'm a little nervous about hanging it up and having it on the floor, but I did want to show you this just beautiful quilt. This is also hand pieced and hand quilted, and I do believe this is an antique quilt. I do believe this one's is more than 100 years old, but again, I'm not a quilt appraiser or a quilt historian, but I do believe that this is an older quilt, and this quilt has been used well and has had a lot of love in this quilt. This is a beautiful quilt. I believe this pattern is called Broken Dishes, and it does have a few holes in it, and you can just tell it's worn. There's yellow here, even though it's hard to see, and it's faded. There are a few stains on this quilt, but I love this quilt just as much as all the others, and I know that whoever had this quilt loved it too and used it, and I'm sure they treasured it as much as I do. Okay, now this quilt is probably the most worn of all the ones that I've showed you today. This pattern is called Rob Peter to Pay Paul, and it has a lot of wear, and there are a lot of holes and a lot of tattered cloth here. But again, I just love it just like I do the others, and it just makes me feel so special that I am the one in possession of these quilts. This pattern is Rob Peter to Pay Paul. It's also known as polka dot or mill wheel, but anyway, I just love this quilt. Some interesting things about this quilt: again, it's hand pieced and hand quilted, and the bindings are different at the top and the bottom. There's this little plaid, and then along the side there's more of a floral, but look at the back. It's that bubblegum pink. Oh my gosh. Again, I just love each and every one of these quilts, and I'll give you a close-up of this one. So those are the 5 quilts I wanted to show you in my little antique vintage quilt trunk show today. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you've enjoyed the video, please give me a thumbs up. Subscribe if you haven't. As always, leave a comment. I love to get the comments. I anticipate the comments. And until next time, have fun quilting.